My friends, I want to start today by telling you what my life looked like just before I turned 70, because I think many of you watching this will recognize yourselves somewhere in this description. I was, on paper, a fortunate man. My health was reasonably good. My finances were stable. My family, though scattered across different cities, still called regularly and visited on holidays. And yet, if you had asked me during that particular year how peaceful I felt on any given ordinary Tuesday, I would have struggled to answer honestly. There was a low, persistent hum of restlessness running underneath most of my days, a sense that something essential was missing, even though I could not have told you exactly what. I remember mentioning this feeling, almost apologetically, to my doctor during a routine visit, half expecting her to tell me this was simply a natural consequence of aging, something to be endured rather than addressed. Instead, she asked me a question that stayed with me for months afterward. She asked what my actual day looked like, hour by hour, not the summary I usually gave people but the specific, granular truth of how I spent my time from waking to sleeping. When I described it honestly, I realized my days were filled with small habits I had never consciously chosen. I checked the news the moment I woke, absorbing whatever anxiety happened to be dominating the headlines that morning before I had even had my first cup of tea. I ate meals in front of the television, barely tasting them. I spent evenings scrolling through old photographs on my phone, quietly grieving a past that could no longer be changed rather than engaging with a present that was actually available to me. None of these habits, taken individually, seemed significant enough to worry about. But together, I slowly came to understand they were quietly manufacturing the very restlessness I could not otherwise explain. Over the following 2 years, I began experimenting, almost as a private project, with small, deliberate changes to these unconscious patterns. Some changes I abandoned after a few weeks, finding they made no real difference. Others, to my genuine surprise, transformed the texture of my daily life so significantly that I now consider them essential, non-negotiable parts of how I choose to live. Today I want to walk you through the 10 changes that made the greatest difference, in the hope that even 1 or 2 of them might do for you what they did for me. None of these changes require significant money, dramatic life upheaval, or perfect health. They require only a willingness to look honestly at your own ordinary Tuesday and ask, as my doctor once asked me, what is actually happening in these small, unexamined hours, and whether it is truly serving the peace you say you want. I want to say clearly, before we begin, that I am not describing a rigid formula meant to be followed in exact order or adopted all at once. I introduced these changes slowly, one at a time, over roughly 2 years, allowing each one to settle into something close to automatic before layering in the next. Some of them, I suspect, will resonate with you immediately, recognizable as something you have already sensed you needed but never quite gotten around to trying. Others may feel entirely irrelevant to your particular circumstances, and that is perfectly fine. I share all 10 simply so you can take what genuinely fits your own life and leave the rest without any guilt attached to setting it aside. The first change, I stopped reading the news before my first hour of waking for most of my adult life. Checking the news first thing in the morning felt like a responsible habit, a way of staying informed and engaged with the wider world rather than retreating into a small, self-centered bubble. But somewhere in my late 60s, I began noticing a pattern I had never examined closely before. Within moments of waking, before I had even fully oriented myself to the day ahead, I was absorbing stories of disaster, conflict, and outrage from every corner of the globe, none of which I had any power to influence, and all of which left a fine residue of anxiety coating the rest of my morning. The change itself was almost embarrassingly simple. I decided to delay checking any news source until after I had finished my morning tea and taken a short walk, giving myself at least 1 full hour of waking life before allowing the wider world's troubles into my mind. The difference this made was far more significant than I expected from such a small adjustment. My mornings, previously colored by whatever anxious headline happened to greet me first, became genuinely mine again, quiet and unhurried, before the noise of the world was permitted entry. I want to be clear that I did not stop following the news altogether, and I do not believe ignorance of the world is any path toward genuine peace. I simply learned that the timing of when I absorbed difficult information mattered enormously to how that information settled into my body and mind. Reading the very same difficult headline at 9 in the morning, after I had already grounded myself in an hour of quiet routine, affected me completely differently than reading it in the vulnerable, half-asleep moments immediately after waking. This tiny shift in timing alone reduced my morning anxiety more than almost any other single change I made during this entire process. I have since noticed this same principle applying well beyond the news itself. Any difficult or demanding input, an unresolved worry, a pending decision, an unpleasant email, seemed to affect me far more heavily when encountered in that first vulnerable hour of waking than when encountered later, once I had already given myself some quiet footing for the day. I began treating that first waking hour almost as a kind of protected threshold, deliberately guarding it from anything demanding or upsetting, and allowing only gentle, unhurried activities to occupy it. This small boundary, once firmly established, proved to be one of the most protective habits I adopted during this entire process. The second change, I began eating at least one meal a day without any screen present. I had eaten meals in front of a television or with a phone beside my plate for so many decades that I genuinely did not notice I was doing it until my granddaughter, visiting one weekend, gently pointed out that she could not remember the last time we had eaten together without some screen quietly running in the background. Her observation stung slightly, but it also opened my eyes to a habit that had become so automatic I had stopped registering it as a choice at all. I decided, somewhat tentatively at first, to designate one meal each day, usually dinner, as entirely screen-free, eaten at the table rather than in front of the television, phone placed in another room entirely rather than simply face down beside my plate. The first several attempts felt strange, almost uncomfortable, the silence of the room more noticeable than I expected after so many years of background noise accompanying every meal. But within a couple of weeks, something shifted. I began actually tasting my food again, noticing textures and flavors I had apparently been missing for years without realizing it. More surprising to me than the improved appreciation for food itself was the effect this small ritual had on my relationships. When family visited, this screen-free meal became a natural, unhurried space for genuine conversation, free of the passive distraction a television had always previously provided as an easy escape from silence. I found myself asking my children and grandchildren more thoughtful questions during these meals, and receiving, in turn, more honest and detailed answers than the distracted small talk that had characterized our screen-accompanied meals for years beforehand. The third change, I started writing 3 sentences each night about the day that had just ended for most of my life. I associated journaling with a discipline I simply did not have the patience for, imagining it required lengthy, eloquent reflections I was not naturally inclined to produce. This assumption kept me from ever attempting even a modest version of the practice until a friend suggested, almost offhandedly, that I try writing just 3 sentences each night, nothing more elaborate than that, simply noting something that had happened, something I had felt, and something I was grateful for. The modesty of this practice is precisely what allowed it to actually stick where more ambitious attempts at journaling had always failed me before. 3 sentences took less than 2 minutes most evenings, small enough that I never found a reasonable excuse to skip it entirely, even on days when I felt too tired for anything more demanding. Over the following months, I accumulated a small, growing record of my ordinary days, and rereading entries from a few weeks earlier gave me an unexpected sense of how much quiet richness had actually been present in days I might otherwise have forgotten entirely. This tiny practice also served a second, less expected purpose. On difficult nights, when my mind wanted to spiral into worry or rumination before sleep, the simple discipline of finding one genuine thing to be grateful for, however small, gently redirected my attention away from anxious thought patterns and towards something steadier and calmer. I did not always feel grateful in the moment I began writing, but the act of searching for something worth naming often produced a small, unexpected shift in my mood by the time I had finished the 3rd sentence, a shift that made falling asleep considerably easier than it had been during my years without this practice. I also found, quite unexpectedly, that this small written record became a genuine comfort during harder stretches of grief or loneliness that arose over the following months. Rereading a string of entries from a particularly difficult season reminded me, in my own handwriting, that I had survived similarly difficult stretches before and had still managed to find something worth noting even then. This quiet, cumulative evidence of my own resilience, gathered 3 sentences at a time, gave me a steadier confidence in facing whatever difficulty happened to arrive next, simply because the record itself proved I had weathered hard seasons before without losing the capacity for gratitude entirely. The 4th change, I began taking a 20-minute walk without any destination or purpose for most of my life. Walking had always been purposeful, a means of getting somewhere rather than an activity valuable in its own right. Walking to the shop, walking to a meeting, walking the dog around the same familiar block as quickly as reasonably possible. The idea of walking simply to walk, with no particular destination or task attached to it, felt almost indulgent to me at first, a waste of time I could otherwise be spending on something more clearly productive. I decided to try this anyway, somewhat skeptically, setting aside 20 minutes each afternoon purely to walk in whatever direction felt appealing that day, with no errand to complete and no particular pace to maintain. The first few attempts felt oddly aimless, my mind restlessly searching for some task to attach to the activity even when none was required. But gradually, over several weeks, I noticed my mind beginning to settle into these walks differently, no longer rushing toward a destination but simply noticing the world around me, a particular tree beginning to bud, a neighbor's garden taking unexpected shape, the quality of light at that particular hour of the afternoon. This small daily practice became, somewhat to my surprise, one of the most reliable sources of peace in my entire week. I found that problems weighing on my mind at the start of these walks often resolved themselves quietly by the end. not through active deliberate thought but through the simple, undirected wandering of attention that unhurried walking seemed to invite. I have since come to believe that much of the restlessness I felt in earlier years came from a life almost entirely organized around purposeful tasks, leaving no space at all for the kind of unstructured wandering, both physical and mental, that this small daily walk finally restored to my life. The fifth change: I reduced my social obligations to only the ones I genuinely looked forward to for most of my adult life. I said yes to nearly every social invitation extended to me, believing that declining an invitation was inherently rude, regardless of whether I actually wanted to attend. This meant my calendar was often filled with gatherings I dreaded rather than anticipated, obligations attended out of guilt rather than genuine desire, leaving me perpetually more depleted than nourished by my own social life. The change I made here required a small but significant shift in how I evaluated invitations as they arrived. I began asking myself honestly, before accepting anything, whether I genuinely looked forward to this particular gathering, or whether I was simply saying yes out of habit or obligation. This was, at first, an uncomfortable question to ask myself sincerely, and an even more uncomfortable practice to act upon once I had answered it honestly, particularly when the honest answer meant declining an invitation from someone I cared about. What surprised me most was how much more genuine warmth I brought to the gatherings I did choose to attend, once my calendar was no longer cluttered with obligations I resented. Rather than arriving everywhere slightly depleted and eager for the evening to conclude, I began arriving at the events I had deliberately chosen with real enthusiasm, and this shift in my own energy noticeably improved the quality of my presence with the people I did spend time with. I lost a small handful of more superficial acquaintances who seemed to expect automatic attendance regardless of genuine interest. But the relationships that remained deepened considerably, now built on my authentic desire to be present rather than a reflexive sense of social duty. I want to acknowledge honestly that declining an invitation still occasionally produces a flicker of guilt in me, even years into this practice, particularly when the person extending the invitation is someone I genuinely care about but simply do not wish to see in that particular setting or at that particular time. I have learned to let this flicker of guilt exist without allowing it to override my honest answer, understanding that a single declined invitation, offered kindly and with genuine warmth toward the person asking, rarely damages a relationship nearly as much as years of resentful, obligatory attendance eventually does. I have also come to notice that this practice quietly changed how others treated my own invitations in return. Friends and family, observing that my yes now genuinely meant yes, began trusting my responses more fully, and several told me they appreciated always knowing where they stood with me rather than wondering whether an accepted invitation carried a hidden reluctance beneath it. This unexpected byproduct, a new kind of clarity and trust running in both directions, became one of the quieter rewards of a change I had originally undertaken purely for my own peace of mind. The sixth change: I began keeping a small, physical list of 3 things I was looking forward to during my restless period. I noticed that my days often felt indistinguishable from one another, each one blending into the next without any particular anticipation attached to the days ahead. A friend suggested a small practice that initially struck me as almost too simple to matter: keeping a short, handwritten list, always containing exactly 3 items, of things I was genuinely looking forward to, whether they were happening later that same day or several weeks in the future. This modest list, kept on a small card by my kitchen sink where I would see it multiple times daily, changed the texture of my anticipation in a way I had not expected from something so minor. Rather than facing each morning with a vague, undirected restlessness, I found myself consciously aware of at least 3 specific things ahead of me worth genuine anticipation: a phone call with my son planned for later that afternoon, a book I was eager to continue that evening, a small trip planned for the following month. I discovered that anticipation itself, deliberately cultivated rather than left to arise accidentally, functioned as a genuine source of daily peace, giving my days a subtle forward momentum they had previously lacked. Updating this list regularly, replacing completed items with new ones as they arose, became a small weekly ritual of its own, one that kept me actively engaged with the future rather than passively drifting through days that otherwise threatened to blur together into an undifferentiated stretch of retirement. I also noticed an interesting secondary effect of keeping this list visible near my kitchen sink, a place I passed dozens of times throughout an ordinary day. Simply glancing at these 3 small, handwritten reminders during otherwise unremarkable moments, washing a dish, filling a kettle, seemed to interrupt the low background hum of restlessness I had described to my doctor, replacing it, however briefly, with a small flicker of genuine anticipation. Over time, these brief flickers, repeated many times daily, accumulated into something that felt very much like the steady, underlying contentment I had been searching for, built not from any single large event but from dozens of small, repeated moments of looking forward to something specific and real. The 7th change: I started saying no to requests immediately rather than agreeing to consider them first for most of my life. When faced with a request I privately did not want to fulfill, I would say I needed to think it over, hoping the requester would eventually forget or that circumstances would conveniently make the decision for me. This habit, rather than sparing anyone's feelings, usually just prolonged an uncomfortable uncertainty on both sides, and I often ended up agreeing eventually anyway, simply worn down by the extended deliberation rather than genuinely persuaded. The change here required cultivating a small but significant new courage, responding honestly and promptly, in the moment, when I already knew my true answer was no. This felt, initially, considerably more confrontational than my old habit of polite postponement. But I found, somewhat to my surprise, that people generally respected a prompt, kind refusal far more than they respected weeks of vague, uncommitted hedging that eventually resolved into a reluctant yes I never actually wanted to give in the first place. This small shift dramatically reduced a particular flavor of background anxiety I had carried for decades without fully recognizing its source, the low, persistent hum of unresolved obligations sitting quietly in the back of my mind, waiting for a final decision I kept delaying. Learning to answer honestly and promptly, even when the honest answer disappointed someone, freed up a surprising amount of quiet mental space that I had not realized these lingering, undecided requests had been occupying for so many years. I noticed, too, that this practice slowly restored a kind of self-trust I had not realized I was missing. Each time I honored my own honest answer rather than allowing it to be worn down through prolonged hedging, I reinforced a quiet confidence that my own preferences and limits genuinely mattered, and were worth stating plainly rather than apologizing for or disguising behind vague delay. This small, repeated act of self-respect, practiced dozens of times across many months, contributed meaningfully to the broader sense of settled peace I eventually came to feel in my 70s. The eighth change. I began spending 10 minutes each morning in complete silence before any conversation or task. I had always associated silence with emptiness, an uncomfortable void to be filled as quickly as possible with the radio, a conversation, or some task requiring my attention. The idea of deliberately sitting in silence, without any device or activity to occupy me, felt almost unbearable to attempt at first, and my earliest efforts lasted barely a minute or two before restlessness sent me reaching for some distraction. I persisted with this practice gradually, extending the silence by small increments over several weeks, until 10 minutes each morning, sitting quietly before engaging with the day's first conversation or task, became a comfortable and eventually essential part of my routine. I did not use this time for any formal meditation practice, simply sitting quietly with whatever thoughts or feelings happened to arise, neither pursuing them further nor pushing them away. What I discovered, somewhat unexpectedly, was that this small period of silence each morning created a kind of internal steadiness that lasted well beyond the 10 minutes themselves, extending into how I handled the conversations and small frustrations that inevitably arose later in the day. I found myself reacting less impulsively to minor irritations, pausing more naturally before responding to a difficult remark or an unwelcome piece of news. This steadiness, I eventually understood, was not something the silence itself produced directly, but rather something the daily practice of simply sitting with my own mind, without immediate distraction, had gradually built within me over many months of quiet repetition. I also noticed that this practice slowly changed my relationship with my own thoughts more broadly. Where I had once treated every worry or intrusive thought as something requiring immediate action or resolution, sitting quietly each morning taught me, gradually, that a thought could simply arise, be noticed, and pass on its own without demanding an immediate response from me. This small shift in how I related to my own mind proved to be one of the more subtle but far-reaching changes on this entire list, quietly reshaping how I moved through difficult moments throughout the rest of my day, long after those 10 quiet morning minutes had ended. The ninth change. I began physically decluttering one small area of my home each week. For decades, I had accumulated possessions without much conscious thought, and by the time I reached my late 60s, my home contained rooms and drawers full of items I had not touched or even thought about in years. Old paperwork, gifts I had never particularly wanted, clothing that no longer fit either my body or my current life. I had always assumed this clutter was simply background noise, unrelated to any deeper sense of peace or restlessness I might be experiencing. I decided to test this assumption by committing to clear just one small area each week, a single drawer, one shelf, a small section of closet, rather than attempting the overwhelming project of decluttering my entire home at once. This modest pace made the practice sustainable in a way that more ambitious attempts at organizing had never managed to be for me in the past. Within a few months, room by room, drawer by drawer, my home slowly transformed from a place cluttered with the accumulated weight of decades into a space containing mostly things I genuinely used or loved. The peace this small, gradual practice produced surprised me considerably more than I expected from something so seemingly mundane. I had not realized how much quiet, low-grade stress had been generated simply by living surrounded by physical reminders of unfinished decisions, unused gifts, and possessions that no longer represented who I currently was. As my physical space became lighter, I noticed my own mind following suit, a sense of orderly calm extending from my newly organized drawers into how settled I generally felt moving through my own home each day. An unexpected side benefit of this slow decluttering process was the number of small memories it surfaced along the way, old letters, photographs, and mementos I had forgotten I even owned. Rather than rushing past these discoveries in my effort to simply clear space, I allowed myself to pause with them briefly before deciding what to keep and what to finally release. Several of these small rediscoveries became the basis for meaningful conversations with my children, who were delighted to see old photographs or letters they too had forgotten existed, turning what began as a purely practical exercise in tidiness into an unexpected source of shared family connection as well. The 10th change. I began ending each day by naming one way I had been kind to myself. The final change I want to share with you today may be the simplest of all, and yet it took me the longest to actually adopt as a genuine daily practice. For most of my life, my private internal commentary about my own day focused almost entirely on what I had failed to accomplish, what I could have done better, where I had fallen short of some standard I had set for myself, often without even fully realizing this pattern of harsh self-assessment had become so automatic. I began, quite deliberately, ending each evening by identifying one specific way I had been kind to myself that day, however small, resting when my body needed rest rather than pushing through fatigue, speaking gently to myself after a minor mistake rather than harshly criticizing myself the way I once reflexively would have, allowing myself a genuine pleasure without the usual accompanying guilt. Some evenings, particularly early in this practice, I struggled to find any example at all, which was itself a revealing and somewhat uncomfortable discovery about how rarely I extended myself basic kindness. Over time, this small nightly practice slowly retrained the automatic internal commentary that had run beneath my days for decades. I began noticing opportunities for self-kindness throughout the day itself, not only in the evening reflection, because I had trained my attention to actively look for them rather than remaining focused exclusively on my shortcomings. This shift, more than almost any other change on this list, touched the deepest layer of the restlessness I had originally described to my doctor, because it addressed not simply what I did each day, but the quality of the relationship I carried with myself underneath everything else I did. I want to acknowledge that this particular change felt, at times, the most difficult of all 10 to sustain, precisely because the harsh internal commentary I had carried for decades did not disappear easily or quickly. There were entire weeks when I forgot the practice altogether, slipping back into old patterns of self-criticism before catching myself and gently returning to the nightly habit once again. I have come to believe that this particular change was never actually meant to become effortless. It was meant to remain a conscious, ongoing practice, a small daily act of resistance against a much older and more deeply grooved pattern of self-criticism, one that continues to require gentle, repeated attention even now, years after I first began. My friends, I want to be honest that none of these 10 changes, taken individually, would likely have produced the transformation I eventually experienced. It was the accumulation of all 10 together, practiced consistently over roughly 2 years, that gradually dissolved the restlessness I once could not explain to my doctor, replacing it with a settled, genuine peace that now colors most of my ordinary days. I do not tell you this to suggest you need to adopt all 10 changes at once, which I certainly did not do myself. I built them slowly, one at a time, allowing each new habit to become comfortable before introducing the next. I remember, quite vividly, a follow-up visit with the same doctor roughly 18 months after that original conversation, by which point I had adopted perhaps 7 or 8 of these 10 changes without ever explicitly framing them to myself as a formal project. She asked, almost in passing, how I had been feeling generally, and I found myself pausing, genuinely searching for an honest answer rather than the automatic, polite response I usually gave. To my own surprise, the answer that emerged was simply peaceful, a word I do not believe I would have used honestly to describe myself at any point during the previous decade. She smiled, unsurprised, and told me she had noticed the shift in my entire demeanor even before I had named it myself, which struck me as a quiet, external confirmation of a change I had been experiencing privately for many months already. I think it is worth noting honestly that none of these 10 changes addressed anything dramatic or extraordinary in my circumstances. My health had not suddenly improved. My finances remained essentially unchanged. My family situation was largely the same as it had been during my most restless years. What had changed was not the external shape of my life, but the small, quiet architecture of how I actually moved through each ordinary day within that largely unchanged life. This distinction matters enormously, I believe, because it means genuine peace after 70 does not necessarily require your circumstances to improve at all. It may simply require the kind of honest, patient attention to your own daily habits that I was fortunate enough to be nudged toward by a single good question from my doctor. I think often of that conversation with my doctor, the simple question that started this entire process for me. What does your actual day look like, hour by hour? I would encourage you, if you are watching this today and recognizing some version of my own restlessness in yourself, to ask yourself this same question honestly, without judgment, simply as an act of genuine curiosity about the life you are actually living rather than the life you assume you are living. You may discover, as I did, that peace was never actually as far away or as complicated to reach as it once seemed. It was hiding, quietly, in the small, unexamined hours of an ordinary Tuesday, waiting patiently for you to finally notice it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared brings you the courage to examine your own ordinary days a little more closely, and the peace of knowing that meaningful change, at any age, rarely requires grand gestures. It only requires small, honest attention, repeated patiently over time. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Look closely at your own Tuesdays. And remember that peace, more often than not, is built quietly, one tiny change at a time. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay honest, stay gentle with yourselves, and remember, the smallest changes often carry the largest peace. Thank you for watching.